The tow truck's hook bit into my Ford F-250 before I could unload the generator. Its winch screamed through the morning, metal cable tightening beneath a crust of ice, while diesel fumes rolled across the stone pad beside my house. I had parked there 10 minutes earlier to help the Miller family 3 lots down. Their power had failed during the storm, and the portable generator in my truck bed was the only warm machine they had left. Snow slapped against my gloves as I lowered the tailgate. Then the hook caught. "Stop!" I shouted, gripping the edge of the truck. The operator kept his face turned toward the windshield. Claire came running from the house, her boots cracking through the frozen gravel. She wore my old gray coat over a sweater, and her breath burst white in front of her. "Ethan, what is happening?" "Apparently, I'm trespassing on my own property." I pulled the paper from beneath the windshield wiper. The ink had already begun to bleed where melted snow touched it. Across the top, in thick black letters, it read, "Unauthorized parking on HOA-controlled property." Beneath that was a fine, $500. My name sat below the amount, followed by the address of our home and a parcel number I had never seen before. Claire stepped closer and pressed one gloved finger against the number. "That isn't ours." "It doesn't have to be." A woman called from behind us. Marlene Voss emerged from a white SUV idling beside the road, its headlights glowing through the snow like 2 pale eyes. She wore a cream-colored coat, polished boots, and the expression of someone arriving to inspect a problem she had already decided to punish. "The parking area belongs to Pine Hollow Estates," she said. "Your truck is obstructing HOA-controlled property." I looked past her at the black iron fence separating the stone pad from the subdivision road. The fence was locked at both ends. My name was engraved on the brass plate beside the gate. "This is behind my fence," I said. Marlene's smile tightened. "Your house is behind the fence. The land is governed by the association." The tow cable groaned again. Claire moved between the truck and the SUV, raising her phone. "I'm recording this. Give me your authorization for the tow." Marlene's eyes snapped toward her. "You can record whatever you like. The fine remains valid." Claire didn't lower the phone. She filmed the license plate, the tow company logo, the citation, and the strip of frozen ground beneath the tires. That small decision changed the scene. The operator finally stopped the winch. I took the pin Marlene offered and signed the receipt without arguing. The paper was cold and damp against my palm. "You're accepting responsibility," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm confirming that you handed me a document." I slid the receipt into my coat and looked again at the parcel number. It ended in 19B. Our deed, the one my father had kept in a fireproof box, carried a different number entirely. Marlene turned toward the tow truck. "Move it." As the cable slackened, Claire zoomed in on the citation and whispered, "Why would they fine you under a parcel that isn't your home?" I watched the snow collect along the fence line, covering the old survey stakes one by one. For the first time, the $500 didn't feel like the real threat. Someone had decided that a number on a piece of paper was enough to redraw the boundary beneath my tires, and now I had to find out who gave them that number. Snow kept tapping against the kitchen windows, soft as thrown sand, while the printer in the corner spat out page after page. By 7:15, Pine Hollow Estates had received Marlene Voss's version of what happened. My phone vibrated across the counter. Then it vibrated again. Claire picked it up before I did. The neighborhood email called me an outside disruptor, accused me of abusing emergency access, and warned residents that my continued disregard for community standards could put everyone's property values at risk. At the bottom, Marlene had attached a photograph of my Ford F-250 beside the fence, the $500 citation visible beneath the windshield wiper like evidence in a criminal case. "She sent this to every owner," Claire said. Her thumb stopped on the last line. "She's telling them you don't belong here." I pulled on my boots and drove to the Pine Hollow gatehouse. The road was glazed with ice, and the tires hissed over salt while gray light pressed against the windshield. My access card flashed red at the reader. I tried it again. Red. The gate motor hummed on the other side, perfectly willing to open for everyone except me. Marlene's white SUV rolled up behind my truck, its tires crunching over frozen gravel. She lowered the window, and the smell of expensive coffee drifted into the cold air. "Your privileges have been suspended," she said, "until the board reviews your conduct. You disabled my access because I parked on my own parcel? You parked on property controlled by this association. She lifted a gloved hand before I could answer. And you will not use that truck to intimidate residents again. The barrier arm rose for her. It stayed down for me. Claire had already called the management office from the passenger seat. She put the phone on speaker and asked for the citation policy, the meeting minutes authorizing the suspension, and the document proving HOA control over Parcel 19B. Her voice stayed level, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. Those records are available to members through proper channels, the manager said. Then provide the proper channel, Claire replied. Submit a written request, Marlene cut in, and stop creating drama. She drove through the gate, leaving a ribbon of exhaust hanging in the air. I parked outside the entrance because there was nowhere else to go. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was a commercial builder I had spent 6 weeks negotiating with. The contract required my truck and equipment on site that morning. Instead, both were sitting on the wrong side of Pine Hollow's gate while the access card remained frozen. We had to hire someone else, the builder said. The storm deadline doesn't move. The call ended with a click. The lost contract was worth $8,400. I placed the phone face down on the dashboard. Claire turned toward me and opened a blank document on her laptop. They want a paper trail, she said. We'll give them one. She drafted a formal demand for the governing documents, the access suspension, and every citation issued against us. I signed it with a black pen while snow melted from my cuffs onto the truck mat. Before we left, Claire sent the request to the HOA, the management company, and Marlene's board email. Seconds later, Marlene responded with one sentence. Pay the $500 fine within 10 days, or the association will pursue legal action. Claire read it aloud. I looked through the windshield at the locked gate, the red access light, and the white SUV disappearing between the houses. Then I started the engine. Good, I said. Now they've put their threat in writing. Summary: after the tow incident, Marlene Voss uses the neighborhood email system to portray Ethan as an outsider who violated community standards. She then disables his HOA access card, forcing him to leave his Ford F-250 outside the gate in freezing weather. Claire actively challenges the association by requesting the citation policy, meeting minutes, and proof that the HOA controls Parcel 19B. Marlene refuses to explain and orders them to submit a formal request. Because Ethan cannot reach a commercial job with his truck and equipment, he loses an $8,400 contract. Rather than retreat, Claire creates a written paper trail and sends demands to the HOA, management company, and board. Marlene answers with a 10-day deadline and a threat of legal action, giving Ethan documented evidence of the association's coercion. Bible frowny face, name: Ethan, age: role: property owner and narrator. Note: owns the Ford F-250 and Parcel 19B. Loses an $8,400 commercial contract after HOA disables his access. Name: Claire, age: role: Ethan's wife. Note: calmly requests HOA records, drafts the formal demand, and creates the written legal paper trail. Name: Marlene Voss. Age: role: HOA president. Note: smears Ethan publicly, suspends his access, refuses to provide authority, and threatens legal action within 10 days. The snap of a bolt cutter echoed through the backyard before sunrise, sharp against the hiss of wind slipping under the eaves. Frost glittered on the fence wire, and the metal smelled faintly of rust when Claire stepped outside with her phone in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Ethan was already 40 minutes away, driving toward a commercial job he could barely afford to lose after Marlene Voss disabled his access card. Claire had expected another email. She had not expected 8 vehicles sitting on Parcel 19B. Their tires had carved dark grooves through the frozen gravel, crossing the private boundary like the line had never existed. A silver crossover blocked the equipment shed. 2 black pickups stood beside the old retaining wall. 5 more cars filled the paved strip Ethan had used to unload the generator during the storm. The auxiliary gate hung open, one hinge twisted downward. Its padlock lay in the snow, split cleanly through the shackle. Claire walked closer, boots crunching over ice. The security camera above the shed was still blinking, but its lens faced the sky. Someone had rotated it by hand. She did not touch the gate. She photographed the broken lock, the tire tracks, the camera angle, and every license plate. Then she called Ethan. "They're on our land," she said. Her breath clouded the phone screen. "How many?" "8 vehicles. The gate is cut." Silence filled the line except for the low growl of his truck engine. "Don't move anything," Ethan said. "I'm coming home." "I'm not moving anything," Claire answered. "I'm recording everything." By the time Ethan reached the property, the snow had softened into wet, gray slush. Diesel fumes drifted from his Ford F-250 as he stopped outside the disabled access point. He stared through the fence at the vehicles, jaw tight, one gloved hand resting on the steering wheel. A laminated notice had been zip-tied to the broken gate. It carried the Pine Hollow Estates logo and a single sentence: "Temporary overflow parking authorized by the association." No signature, no parcel number, no permission from the owners. Ethan pulled the paper free and folded it once. "They're treating our land like their lot," he said. Claire turned her phone toward him, and they turned the camera away before they did it. At noon, Marlene's email arrived. The subject line read, "Maintenance reimbursement, immediate payment required." Attached was an invoice for $2,800, listing gate access, gravel repair, traffic coordination, and community area restoration. Beneath it, Marlene wrote that failure to pay would trigger collection proceedings and a possible property lien. Ethan's thumb pressed hard into the paper until it creased. Claire placed a fresh folder on the kitchen table beside the cold coffee and the warm printer tray. She labeled it with the date, then sent a formal preservation request to Marlene, the management company, and every board member, demanding that all camera footage, access logs, emails, vehicle records, and invoices be retained. The message left the house with a quiet electronic chime. Outside, 8 cars remained behind Ethan's broken lock. Now the question was no longer who had entered the property, but who had ordered them there, and what else the HOA had already erased. The HOA office smelled of stale coffee, warm printer paper, and wet wool tracked in from the storm. Fluorescent tubes buzzed above the reception desk, while meltwater ticked from my boots onto the gray vinyl floor. Claire carried our evidence folder against her chest, its corners bent from being opened and closed all night. I followed her into the conference room, where Marlene Voss sat at the head of a polished table with 3 board members arranged beside her like a jury that had already reached a verdict. On the wall, a framed sign read Pine Hollow Estates, Community First. Marlene tapped a remote, and a glossy map appeared on the screen. The shaded blue section behind our house was labeled Shared Utility and Overflow Parking Area. "There," she said, sliding a finger along the boundary. "The association has always managed that parcel." Claire leaned toward the screen. "Who surveyed this map?" Marlene's smile tightened. "Our management company." "Where is the surveyor's signature?" Claire asked. "Where is the county recording number?" The room went quiet except for the dry rattle of the projector fan. Marlene folded her hands. "You're confusing paperwork with authority." I looked at the blue shape. It covered the exact strip of gravel where my F-250 had been parked, where the 8 vehicles now sat behind my cut lock, and where Pine Hollow had been directing traffic for years. "That map doesn't show ownership," I said. "It shows what you want people to believe." One board member shifted his coffee cup. The cardboard sleeve squeaked against the table. Marlene pressed a button, and a printed notice slid from the printer behind us. "Since you insist on creating public conflict," she said, "the board has voted to assess an additional $5,000 penalty for damaging the community's reputation." Claire reached for the paper, but Marlene pulled it back. "You'll receive it by certified mail." "For asking for records?" Claire said. "For disrupting association operations," Marlene answered. Her voice was smooth, almost bored. "Pay the $2,800 maintenance invoice and the new assessment, or collection proceedings will begin." The word lien landed heavier than the paper. Outside, a snowplow groaned along the road, chains scraping over ice. I thought about the contract I had lost when the HOA held my truck overnight. I thought about the mortgage, the repair bills, and the simple quiet of our property before Marlene decided a gate made her sovereign. Selling the house would have been easier. A real estate sign, a moving truck, one clean cut from the neighborhood that treated ownership like a privilege it could revoke. Claire placed her hand flat on the folder. "If we leave, they keep doing this to someone else." I looked through the window at the snow-covered road, then back at Marlene's map. She expected anger. Instead, I took the $5,000 notice from her hand and folded it once. "We're not selling," I said. "We're staying." Marlene's eyes narrowed. "Then you'll follow the rules." I set the notice beside her coffee and pushed it back across the table. "No. From now on, you'll prove you have the right to make them." That evening, Claire began sorting every deed, invoice, photograph, and access record by date. I cleared a space in the garage and set the broken lock beneath a bright work lamp. The metal still carried gray dust from the cut. By midnight, our house no longer felt like a place we might abandon. It felt like the line they had finally forced us to defend. And before sunrise, Claire wrote one question across the top of a new file. Who owned Parcel 19B before Pine Hollow learned how profitable it was to pretend? By late afternoon, rain had replaced the snow, tapping against the courthouse windows while the fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of metal filing cabinets. The archive room smelled of damp paper, dust, and the sharp plastic heat from an aging scanner. Claire pushed through the glass door with a yellow legal pad under one arm and a list of parcel numbers in her hand. I followed her past shelves packed with decades of property records, still carrying the cold in my coat from Parcel 19B. "If Marlene's map is real," Claire said, "the county should have a recording number." She set her pad beneath the clerk's desk light and began working through the indexes. The scanner groaned. Pages whispered across the counter. Every modern subdivision document pointed back to the same 1986 land division, but the copy Pine Hollow had shown us was missing the surveyor's signature and the original recording stamp. Claire didn't argue with the paper. She turned it over, checked the margins, and wrote each missing mark in neat block letters. 40 minutes later, her fingers stopped on a faded entry. There, the clerk pulled a gray folder from the back shelf. Its cardboard edges were soft from years of humidity, and a stripe of brown dust fell across Claire's sleeve when she opened it. Inside was the original parcel map. A thick black line separated Pine Hollow Estates from a narrow rectangle labeled Parcel 19B. Our land. Not a common area. Not an amenity. Not HOA-controlled property. Claire placed the map flat beneath the glass and leaned closer. A typed clause sat beneath the boundary notes. Temporary parking access granted to Pine Hollow Estates for a period not exceeding 3 years during primary road construction. The date was October 1986. 3 years had ended more than 30 years ago. I felt the edge of the paper catch beneath my thumb. "That explains the old tire tracks," I said. Claire shook her head. "It explains the original access. It doesn't explain why Marlene is still using it." She kept reading. The clause ended with a reference to an additional attachment, one that required the founder's signature and county recording. The attachment was not in the folder. Claire checked the index twice, then a third time, her pencil tapping against the laminate counter. "This is the part they'll attack," she said. "They'll say the temporary language was replaced." "Can we use this now?" I asked. "We can use it to prove their map is incomplete. We can't use it to prove the final transfer without the attachment." She made 3 photocopies anyway. One went into our evidence file. One she sealed in an envelope. The third she held against the window, where gray daylight revealed a faint handwritten notation in the margin. "See mortgage file." Claire's phone vibrated before she could write it down. An email from Marlene waited on the screen. "Pay the $5,000 penalty within 10 days, or Pine Hollow would begin collection proceedings against our home." Claire looked from the deadline to the parcel map. Then she closed the folder and slid it toward the clerk. "Pull every mortgage reference connected to Parcel 19B, she said. "We're not leaving that attachment in the dark." The furnace clicked off just as the first envelope slapped against the kitchen window, carried there by the wind. Frost silvered the glass, and the room filled with the smell of cold coffee and burnt toast. I picked up the envelope before it slid onto the floor. Claire's name was printed across the front in black block letters. Inside was a notice from the county planning office. Her temporary suspension from the local planning advisory board, effective immediately. The accusation was simple: unauthorized access to restricted county records. The evidence was a statement Marlene Voss had circulated through Pine Hollow's neighborhood email group, claiming Claire had broken into the archive to manufacture a private land dispute. By noon, Marlene had added another message. She called me an outsider, a hostile property owner, and a threat to the community standard. Someone attached a photograph of my Ford F-250 behind our fence, the truck half covered in snow like proof of a crime. I read the messages beside the sink while ice ticked against the window. Then I forwarded every document to our attorney and started printing copies for the neighbors. They need to see what she's doing, I said. Claire came in from the hallway with her coat still on, a red folder pressed against her ribs. She placed one hand over the printer tray before the first page finished sliding out. Not yet. She's already telling everyone we stole records. And if we release the parcel map without the mortgage attachment, Marlene will say the temporary parking clause is still active. Her voice stayed level, but her fingers tightened around the folder until the cardboard bent. Outside, a mailbox door clanged shut. Through the blinds, I watched two neighbors cross the street rather than pass our driveway. One lifted a gloved hand toward us, then lowered it when a white HOA SUV rolled by. The silence that followed felt heavier than the snow. I shoved the papers into a stack. We can't keep waiting while she buries us. Claire turned toward me. This isn't waiting. It's making sure the first thing we put in front of a judge cannot be twisted. You lost your board position today. I know. And I lost the Miller contract because they held my truck overnight. I know that too. The furnace kicked back on with a dry metallic shudder. Heat came through the vent, but the kitchen remained cold. For the first time since the fines began, we stood on opposite sides of the same table, with the parcel map between us and Marlene's deadline hanging above everything. Claire did not argue again. She picked up the sealed envelope from the archive, tucked it into her coat, and left before I could stop her. 2 hours later, she returned with wet snow melting along her boots and a banker's box balanced against her hip. She set it on the counter. The cardboard was stained at one corner, and the box smelled of mildew, dust, and old adhesive. I traced the founder, she said. The original Pine Hollow developer didn't keep control of the HOA. She opened a file and placed a faded transfer agreement beneath the kitchen light. He sold the management rights to a real estate company years before Marlene became president. I stared at the signature line. Claire tapped the page once. Marlene didn't inherit that authority. She bought access to it. Then she pulled out a mortgage reference stamped with the words attachment missing. Now we find out what that company knew about Parcel 19B. The next morning, Claire sent the transfer agreement and every preserved notice to the county prosecutor and the resident's attorney. She did not ask Marlene for permission. She made the accusation official. The metal drawer in the county archive groaned across its rails, scattering a thin smell of rust, dust, and old paper into the cold room. A fluorescent tube buzzed overhead while Claire slid a banker's box onto the table and brushed gray powder from its lid. I stood beside her, my gloves still damp from the morning frost, watching her work through a stack of mortgage files stamped with dates from 1986 through 1991. The missing attachment had not vanished. It had been misfiled under the original developer's lender, 3 shelves away from the Parcel 19B records. Claire opened a folder with a plastic knife. Inside was a folded document, brittle at the edges and yellow beneath the archive lights. Across the top, in block letters, were the words, temporary parking easement. She flattened it with both hands. The clause was simple. Pine Hollow Estates could use Parcel 19B for overflow parking during construction of the main road. 3 years. No renewal. No permanent access. No authority to collect fees. The expiration date sat beneath the paragraph like a locked door. December 31st, 1989. Claire turned the page. The second sheet carried a mortgage stamp, a lender's seal, and the signature of my father, Daniel Cole. He had purchased Parcel 19B in 1991, after the easement had already died. My throat tightened as I read the legal description. The same boundary markers. The same stone strip beside our house. The same land Marlene had called a community utility area, while sending tow trucks after my Ford F-250. Your father didn't just buy the parcel, Claire said. Her fingertips stopped on the final line. He bought it after their right to use it was gone. I remembered Marlene's unsupported map spread beneath the office lights, her finger tapping the colored section where our property sat. She had known. The realization came without drama, just the dry snap of Claire closing the folder. The parking fees, the event advertisements, the $500 ticket, the $2,800 maintenance bill, and the additional $5,000 penalty were not mistakes made by an overconfident board. They were revenue built on land Marlene knew she did not control. Claire photographed every page, then placed the original back inside the sleeve. "We don't hand them the original," she said. "We give the prosecutor a certified copy, the residence attorney another, and we keep the chain of custody intact." She moved with quiet precision, labeling each envelope while the scanner hummed and warm plastic smelled faintly of ozone. I wanted to drive straight to Marlene's white SUV and put the document against her windshield. Claire caught my wrist before I reached for my coat. "If she sees the attachment first, she'll destroy the story before we can prove it." That was when the fight stopped being about convincing our neighbors. Claire signed the archive request, sealed the copies, and walked them to the county clerk's counter herself. By noon, the prosecutor and the residence attorney had the records. By 1, Claire had added a handwritten note. Marlene Voss knew Parcel 19B was privately owned and continued charging residents for access. Then her phone vibrated. A Pine Hollow email announced the winter festival for the following night, promising exclusive private parking on the community's southern parcel. Claire read it once and handed me the screen. I looked through the kitchen window at our fence, silver with ice, and heard the furnace kick against the cold. "Let them advertise," I said. Claire picked up the folder. "Tomorrow, we close the gate." Snow came down in thick, wind-driven sheets, turning the Pine Hollow entrance into a blur of white lights and spinning tires. The air smelled of wet pine, diesel, and the sharp metallic cold that made every breath sting. By 9 o'clock, more than 100 vehicles were rolling toward Parcel 19B, their headlights sweeping across our fence like search beams. Ethan stood beside the new steel gate with his gloves tucked beneath one arm, watching the first SUV stop at the boundary. I held the temporary restraining order inside a clear plastic sleeve, keeping the ink dry while snow rattled against it. "Open the gate," Marlene Voss shouted from her white SUV. Her voice came through the lowered window, mixed with the hiss of the heater. "The festival parking is already paid for." Ethan raised one hand. "Not tonight." Behind him, the Ford F-250 idled on our side of the fence, its exhaust rolling low across the frozen gravel. He had mounted 2 bright work lights above the cab, and their beams caught every license plate, every tire crossing the line, every Pine Hollow parking pass taped to a windshield. The cameras were already streaming. Claire stepped forward before Marlene could slam her door. The paper sleeve crackled in her hand. "Marlene Voss, Pine Hollow Estates HOA, its employees, contractors, guests, and invitees are prohibited from entering Parcel 19B without written permission from the owners." Marlene stared at the order, then laughed once. It came out thin and brittle in the freezing air. "You think a piece of paper can stop a community event?" Claire placed the document against the SUV window. "No, the gate can." Ethan pressed the control on the post. Hydraulic motors groaned beneath the gravel. The steel barrier swung across the entrance, its black surface wet with snow, and locked into place with a heavy mechanical clunk. The line of cars stopped behind it. Engines idled. Windshields fogged. Someone honked twice. Then a dozen more followed, turning the road into a wall of angry sound. Marlene grabbed her phone and called the police. While we waited, she paced beside the gate, boots sinking into slush. She pointed at the parked cars as if they were proof of her ownership. "These residents paid for access," she said. Claire lifted her phone and showed the live camera feed. "They paid the HOA. That does not give the HOA permission to sell access to land it doesn't own." Red and blue lights finally washed over the snow. 2 police officers walked up, their boots grinding against the ice. Marlene rushed toward them, waving the parking permits. Claire calmly handed over the certified order, then the deed, then the county-stamped parcel map. The officers read in silence. One checked the gate line against the survey markers. The other turned toward Marlene. "You need to move everyone back onto the public road." Her face tightened. "This is a private community event. Then hold it on private property you're authorized to use." One by one, the vehicles reversed, tires slipping over the icy pavement. The festival lights went dark behind us. By midnight, Pine Hollow had canceled the event and announced refunds. Ethan kept his hand on the cold gate control. The sign went up before dawn: "Private property, no HOA access." By Monday morning, the snow had hardened into gray ridges along the courthouse steps, and salt crackled beneath my boots as Claire and I carried 3 certified binders through the metal doors. The air inside smelled of wet wool, old paper, and burnt coffee. We had already won the night at Parcel 19B, but the gate only stopped the cars. The court had to stop the machine behind them. Marlene Voss arrived with the HOA board trailing behind her, their polished shoes leaving dark half-moons on the tile. She held the same parking permits she had waved at the police, now folded sharply inside a plastic sleeve. "This is a misunderstanding," she told the judge. Claire opened the first binder. "Then the misunderstanding includes 8 years of invoices, event advertisements, parking fees, towing notices, and penalties issued against land the Pine Hollow Estates HOA never owned." The courtroom went quiet except for the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The judge studied the certified parcel map, then the 1986 subdivision filing, then the old mortgage attachment that carried my father's name beside Parcel 19B. When he looked up, Marlene's fingers had tightened around the sleeve until the plastic bent. "The temporary parking permission expired decades ago," he said. "It was never renewed. The parcel was purchased privately in 1991 and remains private property." One board member shifted in his chair. Another stared at the floor. The judge's ruling came down in plain language. The HOA had no right to enter, control, tow from, fine, advertise, or collect money for access to our land. Every parking penalty tied to Parcel 19B had to be refunded. The $2,800 maintenance charge and the additional $5,000 retaliation fine were void. The HOA was ordered to remove every reference to the parcel from its rules, maps, event notices, and access permits. Marlene tried to interrupt, but the community has relied on that space for years. The judge placed his pen beside the file. "Reliance does not create ownership." That sentence traveled through Pine Hollow faster than any email Marlene had sent about me. By the end of the week, refund checks arrived in the mailboxes of residents who had paid for festival parking. The same homeowners who had called me an outsider now stood beside the road, watching contractors remove the HOA signs from our fence. Claire kept the certified order in a clear folder and carried it to every meeting where Marlene tried to pretend nothing had happened. I kept the deed in the glove box of my Ford F-250, beneath the registration and the old work gloves still dusted with snow salt. The steel gate stayed closed, not as a threat, not as revenge for the truck being towed or the contract I lost. It stayed closed because ownership meant something only when the owner was willing to defend it. Months later, the county recorded the judgment, and Pine Hollow's new notices contained one sentence in bold black ink. Parcel 19B is private property and is not available for HOA use. Claire stood beside me at the gate that evening, the sunset turning the snow orange through the bars. I turned the key, checked the lock, and let the chain settle with a heavy metallic click. Marlene had spent years acting like permission was something she could grant. The court made sure she learned the truth. Sometimes justice is simply knowing exactly where your property ends and closing the gate there.